Alors, on va passer à la session suivante. Et pour faire cela, merci d'accueillir sur scène Andy Jassy, CEO d'Amazon Web Services. Andy, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Andy, I got a bunch of questions here ready for you.
Okay, you always have questions, Miguel.
Let's go ahead. Let's start with the state of Amazon Web Services. Can you give us a quick overview?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's great to be here in Paris. Thank you for coming. I know how busy all of you are, so to spend a day with us is highly appreciated. The business is growing really fast. It's we've been in the market now for 11 and a half years, and in the last financials we released, AWS is a $14 billion revenue run rate business, growing 43% year over year. And we have millions of active customers at this point. And the way we think about an active customer is a non-Amazon entity that's used our platform in the last 30 days. And it really runs the gamut in terms of size of customer and industries in which our customers are using us. And most of the big technology startups have been successfully using AWS almost since the beginning when we launched in 2006. And these are companies like Airbnb and Pinterest and Slack and Domo and Bon Privé and Teads and Front App. Lots of, virtually every technology startup now is using AWS and has built their business on top of the cloud. But what's happened over the last 3 to 4 years is that the enterprise has really started using AWS in the cloud in a very meaningful way. And every imaginable vertical business segment is using AWS. You see it in financial services with companies like Capital One and Societe Generale and Intuit and the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. You see it in healthcare with Johnson & Johnson and Merck and Pfizer and Bristol Myers Squibb. You see it in manufacturing with companies like GE and Schneider Electric and Philips. You see it in the utility space with Engie and Enel. You see it in technology with Netflix runs their everything on top of AWS and Samsung and Adobe. Literally every vertical business segment is using AWS in the cloud in a meaningful way. And we also have a very large public sector business where we have nearly 3,000 government agencies worldwide that are using the platform. So really a very broad and diverse customer base that's growing very quickly. And I'd also say that if you look at the geographic expansion, and first the footprint that AWS has, we have 16 regions, and we consider a region a place in the world where we have multiple data centers. And so we have 16 regions and about 45 availability zones all throughout the world with another bunch of them coming, one here in Paris and one in Sweden and one in China and one in Hong Kong and another one, government cloud in the US. So it's a very broad geographic footprint that's expanding very quickly.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned, Andy, some large conservative organizations making bold move to the cloud. Why do you think that's happening now? And what are the trends that you see worldwide about enterprise adoption?
Well, it's happening quicker and quicker, but it's been happening for a while. Mm-hmm. It's not like this we woke up today and companies started moving to the cloud in a much broader way. And I think there are a few reasons why companies are moving to the cloud so quickly. I think cost is always the conversation starter. And so for most companies, if you can take capital expense and turn that into a variable expense, that's usually attractive. Not having to lay out all that capital up front for data centers and servers ahead of what your demand's going to be is useful. So you get to turn capital expense into a variable expense. That variable expense is going to be lower in AWS than what the vast majority of companies can do on their own. And that's because we have such large scale now in AWS that we pass on to our customers in the form of lower prices, that your variable costs will go down in the cloud. And then you get real elasticity in the cloud. So anybody who's had to try to guess what their capacity requirements are going to be knows it's a perilous and difficult endeavor, because you either guess too high and you provision for the peak and then you sit on a lot of wasted capital, or you guess too low and you can't handle the volume of traffic and you have a terrible customer experience. So what happens is people almost always provision for the peak, and there's a reason they call it the peak. It's because you don't really live at the peak for very long. With the cloud, you provision just what you need, and then if it turns out you need more, you seamlessly scale up, and if you don't need that capacity anymore, you just give it back to us and stop paying for it. That's a very different model than what's existed the last couple decades. So cost is always the conversation starter, but the number one reason that enterprises are moving as quickly as they are to the cloud is for speed and for agility. And if you talk to most enterprises and you ask them how long it takes to get a server to try an experiment, typically your answer ranges from 10 to 18 weeks. And then on top of it, once you have a server, you have to build all of that underlying infrastructure software, so the compute and the storage and the database. And that is a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting. That means it takes a long time for builders to get from an idea to actually in the market. And what happens is, at a lot of enterprises that haven't adopted the cloud, is the builders just get demoralized, and they don't spend their free cycles thinking about how to change the customer experience, because they figure, why bother? It's going to be so hard and so long, it's not likely going to happen. And the cloud completely changes that equation. Of course, you can launch thousands of instances or servers in minutes, and then because we have 95 plus services at this point in our platform, it means that builders don't have to recreate all that infrastructure software. So you get from idea to implementation in record time, several orders of magnitude faster than what you can do on premises. And then for most companies, software development engineers tend to be the scarce resource. And so if you don't have to spend that scarce resource on the infrastructure, which is table stakes, it has to be there or you don't have an application, but it hardly ever differentiates your business, and instead spend that scarce resource on projects that really differentiate your mission. That's usually very attractive for companies. And then most companies at this point, even startups, have global end users. And so in the old days, most people served all of their customers from one location in the world. And because it was actually hard to find a reliable and cost-effective and trustworthy infrastructure provider in other countries, in the cloud, because we have such a broad geographic footprint, you can take your application and put it into lots of regions all over the world, which not only lowers the latency to your end users, but it also means that if you care about data sovereignty in certain geographies, you can easily do so. So that's why people are moving so quickly. And then if you look at the patterns in which people are moving, everybody's moving a little bit differently, but by and large, if you force me to generalize, I would say we see a few kind of sequenced groups of applications that tend to move. Usually first are development and test, which often are the first workloads to move in a big transformation like the cloud, along with altogether new applications. So applications that don't have any legacy, don't have any dependencies, you don't have to worry about migration. They get to take advantage of all the benefits I just mentioned of the cloud right from the start. So that's usually the first set of applications, followed pretty quickly thereafter by digital transformation, so lots of websites, analytics, and today it's never been easier and less expensive to collect, store, analyze, and share data than it is today. Mobile. Most companies have built applications before their employees and end users had 3 screens like they do today, so they're rebuilding all their apps via mobile. And then more recently, people building for the edge, for IoT applications. So that tends to be that second tranche. The next tranche is when companies say, or they realize they have a data center that's coming up for lease renewal or a tech refresh, where they don't really want to actually stay in data centers. And they usually will work with us for 12 to 24 months in advance of that data center update to be able to move all those applications out of that data center and close it down and move it to the cloud. Followed by the last one, which you see more and more of every month, which is companies who want to get the full benefits of the cloud as quickly as possible and go all in. So those, generally speaking, are the ways that we see people adopting cloud.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned, you alluded to the topic of the infrastructure of Amazon Web Services. And AWS has launched many regions. You've seen that, right? We all feel very excited about the new region coming to France in 2017.
Two.
Tell us a little bit more about the future. What are the positive ecosystems development that you see post-region launch?
Well, we have had a really big business in France for a long time. Really, since the beginning of AWS, we have tens of thousands of customers who are using AWS in other regions outside of France. And we've also had a pretty big team here that we've been building over a long period of time. We have a lot of sales and marketing and account and support and solutions architects and professional services. So we've had a pretty big presence here for a while, but what we have heard from a lot of our French customers is that they have a lot of workloads that they would like to move to AWS, but they feel like they can only do so when they either have the lower latency in country here or where they can be sure that the data is residing in country. And so that's why we're building the Paris region. We're really excited about it as well. I think that you'll see not just the ability to kind of really run any workload regardless of what the latency requirements or data sovereignty requirements are. But I think we have such a large partner ecosystem already here in France that I think you'll see a further expansion of once we actually have the region here. That I think it's exciting.
Absolutely. Hey, Andy, you discussed about how customers are moving into Amazon Web Services and moving applications, large workloads, moving all in eventually on Amazon Web Services. Is hybrid still a topic, a question that you get from customers today?
Definitely. I mean, I think that despite the fact that you see more and more customers every month announcing they're going all into the cloud, the vast majority of enterprises will end up still running in hybrid mode for the next 5 to 10 years. And I think in the early days of the cloud in AWS, I think people were confused about this. I think less so today, but they used to think that there was really a binary decision on whether they had to use only the cloud and nothing on premises, or only on premises and nothing in the cloud. And of course, it's not a binary decision. What customers really want is they want to be able to operate their existing data centers that they're not yet ready to retire as seamlessly as possible alongside AWS. And it's really why we've invested over the last half dozen years in as many capabilities as we have to make it easy for customers to run in hybrid mode. And so these are things like our virtual private cloud, which is really effectively like cordoning off a portion of the AWS network, deploying your resources into it, creating subnets that can either be addressable via the internet or just through private IP addresses that you bring, and then connecting it to your own data center topology via VPN. And so most of our enterprise customers use VPC. We have things like Direct Connect, which is a private connection between your data centers and our AWS regions. And we have things like a storage gateway that allow you to keep hot objects on premises while asynchronously loading up all your objects to the cloud. So we have a whole bunch of capabilities that make it easy to run in hybrid mode. And in fact, most of the big hybrid implementations today run on top of AWS. And yet, what we've started realizing over the last year or so is more and more of the mainstream enterprises are building their long-term cloud adoption plans, is that they said, well, actually, you are making us make a binary decision. And we said, well, how's that? And what they explained was that the vast majority of the enterprises in the world are virtualized on VMware. And people have gotten used to operating the VMware software and tools to manage their infrastructure for many years. And because AWS and VMware had really done nothing meaningful to try to integrate their platforms and their offerings, it meant customers were having to make the binary choice of deciding between being able to continue to use those VMware tools that they've gotten used to using, but not really be able to use AWS very effectively, or deciding they're going to move to the cloud regardless and being able to use AWS, but not being able to use those VMware tools. And so they didn't like making that binary decision. They didn't like that we were forcing them to do so. And so we spent a bunch of time with our partners at VMware building an offering that we announced a few months ago that will be available later this year, which is really VMware on AWS, which will allow any customer to take all of that VMware software and tools they've been using for a long time to manage their infrastructure on premises and use those same tools to be able to run their infrastructure on AWS. Customers are very excited about this. It allows them to have that one single set of tools, but also be able to do so without having to buy new hardware, which is a big deal. There are very few enterprises these days that are excited about buying new hardware. They're making a transition now over the next 5 to 10 years. So being able to use those same tools, being able to use it on AWS, not having to buy more hardware to do so is very attractive, and we have a pretty large private beta that we're running right now where customers are excited about us going general availability for it.
Yeah, our partnership with VMware is definitely a very exciting development. And another question that we get a lot from enterprises is the concept of lock-in. How enterprises should be thinking about the relationship with a vendor, or eventually spreading workloads across different providers. What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a question we get asked a lot, and I think that Oracle has made us very aware of this issue, as it's challenging for people to move away from something like that. And I think that if you look at the cloud, it's a really different operating model than what's existed in the past. First of all, the APIs from all of the later coming providers look very similar to the APIs in AWS. And so if you need to move, I think that API movement isn't very difficult to do. I think that also if you look at we build on a lot of open standards, so a lot of the services we use, we build on things like MySQL and Linux and Zen and things of that sort. And then all of our migration services that we've built that allow you to more easily move databases or move various workloads or VMs back and forth, they all work where you can move it into AWS or out of AWS. So there's a two-way passage. And so we have been very fortunate in the 11 years that we've been doing business that we haven't had that many customers who've chosen to move away from us. But we have had some, and if you want to do it, it's viable. Now, I think that if you are thinking about how many clouds you should work with and how to think about how to apportion those workloads, I think what we have found over the last few years is that most large companies start off thinking that maybe what they'll do is they'll split their workloads across multiple clouds. And when they get into the practicality of how they would do it, most aren't going that route. Most are predominantly choosing one provider. And the reason they're not splitting it across multiple providers in any kind of equal way is that if you do so, you have to standardize on the lowest common denominator. And the reality is that these platforms are in really different stages at this point of the game. And AWS has a lot more capability by a large amount than any other provider. And we're also iterating at a faster rate. And it turns out that most companies don't want to tie the hands of their development teams behind their back and not allow them to use the same functionality that a lot of their competitors are using. And there's much more mature ecosystem built on top of AWS than you'll find elsewhere. And we've been doing this a lot longer. We started about 6 or 7 years ahead of the other providers. So I think the maturity of the platforms are in very, very different stages. So the first thing is most companies, when push comes to shove, don't want to standardize on the lowest common denominator. The second thing is, if you've ever had to manage multiple platforms, which any of you who've managed technology have probably had to do, it's painful. It's not fun to have to manage across multiple platforms. And it's a big enough shift for companies to move from on-premises to the cloud. That's a big learning curve for your companies. But then on top of it, to ask those same developers to have to be fluent in multiple platforms is hard, and development teams hate it. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is that you end up, most of the cloud providers have volume discounts. So if you split your volume across multiple providers, you end up diminishing your buying power. And so when CIOs tend to look at this carefully, they tend to predominantly choose one provider. And oftentimes, if they want to make sure that they know they can run on another provider, if their relationship goes sideways with the one they predominantly choose, they'll run some small number of workloads that way. But most don't want to give up the flexibility and the convenience and the resource burden that you get in having to run across multiple.
Let's talk about something that is on the minds not only of enterprises, but startups, government organizations. I'm pretty sure that is in the minds of many of you here today with us. And that's the subject of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Where are we today on those subjects?
Yeah, this is a topic that people are very excited about and ask us about all the time. And one of the things people sometimes don't realize about Amazon, and you heard Werner talking about it a little bit earlier, is that we've been doing this for a really long time. For about 20 years at this point. And if you think about almost everything we do in Amazon, it's informed by machine learning and AI. So, all of our product recommendations and similarities. If you look at the pick paths in our fulfillment centers to really streamline and be more efficient, they're all informed by machine learning algorithms. If you look at the drones that we're building, driven by machine learning. If you look at Alexa, driven by various deep learning techniques. If you look at our X-ray feature that provides all kinds of really interesting media facts on all our devices, those are all driven by machine learning and AI. And we have thousands of people at the company who work on that. But I would say that most companies don't have, at least haven't yet had the ability to have thousands of people working on machine learning in their companies. And so it's really still relatively early in terms of adoption. And the way I see it is at a macro level, there are kind of three layers of the stack. At the bottommost layer, it's really for expert machine learning practitioners, of which, by the way, there aren't that many in the world. And these are people who are comfortable building deep learning models, tuning those models, learning how to do inference, knowing how to train the data, knowing how to get that data out of the models and into production apps. It's a lot of muck. It's hard. And most of the machine learning and deep learning being done in the cloud today is being done on top of AWS on our P2 instances that Werner was talking about earlier that are optimized for this workload. And then on these machine images that we have that effectively have the deep learning libraries embedded in them. And, interestingly, it's interesting to see how different companies are approaching this problem. I think unlike some others who are really trying to push everybody to one deep learning framework, we support them all. And the reality is when you look at it, TensorFlow has a lot of people using it, and we have loads and loads of customers using and running TensorFlow workloads on top of AWS. But it's also true that, if you're interested in computer vision, Caffe is typically the deep learning framework you most want. Or if you're looking at video and image analysis or recommender services or natural language processing or speech recognition, MXNet tends to scale the best. And so if there's one thing that you've seen over the last couple decades of machine learning is that the trends move pretty quickly and people invent new mechanisms and new techniques to do machine learning and deep learning. And so you want to make sure that you can pursue all the different frameworks that exist, and that's why we support them all. So that's at the lowest layer of the stack. Now, one of the things, if you look at the history of AWS and everything that we've done, is that we try to think about democratizing technology so that any company, no matter how large or how small, has access to the same capabilities and the same scale and the same cost structure as the largest technology companies in the world. That's what we've done in AWS over the last 11 years. And we have a very strong belief that if we don't make machine learning and deep learning more accessible to everyday developers, which is not really today, it's hard, that machine learning won't spread the way it can and the way we believe it will. And so today, we have a service out there called Amazon Machine Learning. We have many thousands of people who use the service. But we think even that service is harder than it should be for our customers to figure out how to hide a lot of that muck of building the models and tuning the models and training the models and doing the inference. And so we're spending a lot of time at this middle layer of the stack trying to make it easier and easier and more approachable for everyday developers to do machine learning and deep learning. And then at that top layer of the stack, they're really solutions. It's things like, here's an image, tell me what the image is. Or here's a face, does it match this list of other faces in facial recognition? Or here's some text, and give me speech on the other end. Or help me build conversational apps or bots. And that's why we built Recognition, which does object recognition and facial recognition, and Poly, which does text-to-speech, and Lex, which is really the technology that's in Alexa for companies to build conversational apps. And it's why you see so many people adopting these services. And the thing to remember when you're doing machine learning is oftentimes people get very ensconced with the top level services. But to really do machine learning at a deep level, the way most companies will, it doesn't only require those top level services. It requires having a highly available, highly durable, highly featured data store or data lake, having great security, because that data, even though it's just for analytics and machine learning, that data is going to be really important data that has personally identifiable information in it. So a great data lake, really strong security, really strong analytics services, and you won't find analytics services more with broader selection than you will in AWS, and then great machine learning capabilities up and down that stack. And the combination of our investment in the machine learning pieces alongside our offering in the storage and the security and the analytics spaces is why so many people are running the machine learning workloads on AWS.
Yeah. Exciting areas, huh? Artificial intelligence, machine learning.
Big opportunity for companies.
Big opportunity. Everybody can innovate on that.
Yeah.
Andy, we talked about many things that are moving to the cloud. We talked about application, workloads, servers. Let's talk for a minute about something that is not in the cloud, and those are connected devices. How do you think about that? Where do they fit?
Well, I think that if you fast forward 10 years, when people talk about the on-premise part of hybrid, it's not going to be servers. I think all those servers are going to be in the cloud, or virtually all of them. But I think what they're going to be talking about is their connected devices. And there are going to be billions of these devices in our homes, in our offices, in factories, on ships and cars and planes, and the oil fields and agrarian fields, everywhere. And what's interesting about these connected devices is, by definition, they have relatively little CPU and relatively little disk. And so the cloud becomes disproportionately important to supplement them. And in fact, if you look at most of the big IoT cases today, they are using AWS to help supplement them, whether you're talking about Angie with the IoT applications they're building, or if you look at Illumina, their genome sequencing is hooked up to AWS to do mass analytics, or John Deere has 200,000 telematically enabled tractors that are collecting all of this planting information in real time, doing analytics in the cloud, and then sending that information back to the planters. And so you see a broad amount of usage in these IoT applications in the cloud, where there's more disk and there's more CPU to do analytics. But what you find is increasingly companies are building these devices where there are some functions that they don't want to make a call back to the cloud. They don't want to deal with the round-trip latency in the cloud, or sometimes they just don't have connectivity to the internet. And what they've asked us for is a way to actually have the same types of triggers and analytics that they have in the AWS IoT and the cloud on those devices. Because if you've ever tried to program to those embedded devices, if you're not an embedded devices developer, it's really hard. And even if you are, it's hard to make those changes without taking the whole fleet down. Sure. And so what we built and we announced at our conference in the fall, reInvent, is something called Greengrass, which effectively is a software module that you can embed in your devices that runs Lambda, which is our serverless, event-driven computing service. And so what it means now, if you're a developer, is that you can program the triggers or the signals on which you want to do analytics, and you can program it once from our console in AWS, and you can program which triggers you want to run in the cloud and which ones you want to run on the device itself, all in the same common programming model, which is very compelling. And then we also have something called Snowball Edge. And so we launched, a couple of years ago, we launched something called Snowball. And this was to help companies that were trying to transport a lot of data, but it was too expensive or too time-consuming to do it over the wire, to be able to load it into an appliance. So Snowball was a 50-terabyte appliance. It had 3 different types of encryption. It has a Kindle attached to it, so you make sure you send it to the right place, and you can track its ingestion. And that actually took off a lot faster than any of us anticipated. And we built a second version of Snowball, informed by what customers told us mattered to them. And they asked, not only do we want it to be twice the size, so this is a 100 terabyte appliance, and not only do we want it to have a synchronous endpoint to be able to load data into S3 in real time, and not only do we want it to have clustering, so I don't have to keep a copy of my data on premises, but we want compute in the Snowball Edge as well. And so we put compute in there, which is really almost like an M4 equivalent instance in a Snowball Edge. And so what we see customers doing now is we see examples like GE. So GE has these wind turbines in various parts of the world where they don't have consistent internet connectivity, but there's a lot of things that they see in those turbines, signals that they see, or anomalies that they see, or things they want the other turbines to be aware of so they can communicate with one another. And so what they do is they use this Snowball Edge, they collect all of this data from the wind turbines, they set up analytics and triggers. If they see certain signals, they want to do this set of analytics and then inform the rest of the turbines that way. And so they do that. They're able to do that compute and analytics on premises, at the turbines. And then when they fill up those Snowball Edges with all that data, they just disconnect them, send them back to us to ingest so they can do broad-scale analytics in AWS and replace them with another Snowball Edge that starts to collect that information, do analytics. So I think that we're at the very beginning of what you're going to see in edge computing and in connected devices. We have a huge investment in that space. And I think you'll see a lot more from us there moving forward as well.
Definitely. Andy, we tend to get a lot of questions from customers about new services, new features. But we also get a lot of questions about how we innovate so quickly. And what are the lessons learned that eventually we could share with them that they could apply to the business? Can you share your view on that?
Yeah. Well, I think that every culture is different and every company is different. And there's no right or wrong way. I can only share some of the things I think that have been helpful for us at Amazon to enable ourselves to move quickly. I think the first thing I would say is that we tend to over-index in hiring builders. And we think of builders as people who are not just innovators, but people who look at a different customer experience, whatever it is, try to be honest about what the flaws are in that customer experience, and then want to reinvent it. And we also think about builders as being folks who understand that launch is the starting line, not the finish line. In the early days of Amazon, and I've seen this at a lot of other companies as well, we had a lot of V1 people. So people who were really excited about getting to launch, and then when launch happened, they lost interest. And the reality is that virtually nothing any of us build is a success on day one. It always takes iterating and learning and listening to what customers care about and iterating on their behalf before you have a product that really resonates and builds a more sustainable business. So we tend to over-index in hiring builders. And then the second thing is that we organize those builders into as small and autonomous and separable teams as we can, that we try to remove all the blockers to their ability to own their own destiny. And that was another thing we saw in the early days of Amazon. We were organized in such a way where the teams, you had developers in one group, product managers in another group, operations people in another group, and the teams would often not get things done, and the excuse was, well, I didn't get the right requirements for product management, or I couldn't get development to prioritize this. And it was frustrating to those individuals, and it was frustrating to us because we just got things done a lot slower than we wanted. And so what we do is we try to organize all the people that you need in those teams as part of the same team. And so you eliminate a lot of that finger pointing. You eliminate people feeling like a victim where they're being held up by other teams. You get very high levels of ownership, and then those teams tend to spend a lot of time with their customers, get to know their customers really well, and they completely own their roadmaps. And they will very frequently change their roadmap mid-year as they get feedback on things that are more important than they first thought when they started the year. So we hire a lot of builders. We organize them into separable small teams that own their own destiny. And then the third thing is we give them the ability to use the same building blocks that all of you use in AWS. And so I think one of the most interesting stories about Amazon that hasn't really been told, in part because I think people have been really interested in the AWS story, is just how fast Amazon's consumer businesses have innovated and iterated over the last 10 years. And there's a lot of incredible people on those teams, but I think they would all tell you a big piece of it is their ability to use AWS at scale, and they're some of the largest users of AWS. And the fourth thing I would say is I think at most big companies, as they get successful, they tend to develop something that Roy Disney used to call the institutional no, which is that management walks into meetings about new ideas looking for ways to say no. And they're not doing it because they're evil or because they don't like invention or they're ill-intended in any way. It's just that there's a lot going on at the company. And when you're organized in a highly centralized fashion, the idea of taking on 5, 6 new projects in the middle of the year that you didn't anticipate can seem overwhelming. And so that, lots of times they walk into those meetings trying to find ways to poke holes in the idea to not have to do it. I think in AWS and in Amazon in general, we have really the opposite culture. We are, as a leadership team, there's nothing we like better than walking into meetings with people pitching new ideas. We don't say yes to every new idea, and we try to be rigorous in the ones that we pursue and ask lots of questions, but the mode in the room is we're trying to problem solve with our builders to find a way to yes. And that's because there are so many more ideas that you learn about during the year or that you were inspired by during the year than when you did the operating planning. If you are constrained to just the ideas you had whenever you do your operating plan, you just have to get lucky that you think about every possible year or you have to wait another year. And so we say yes to a lot more ideas than most other companies. And then the last thing I'd say is that you have to be willing to make mistakes and to fail if you're going to innovate and push the envelope in experimenting. And I think in many ways the failure that we had with our phone was, I think, completely emblematic about the way we think about innovation in Amazon, and something that was probably a much bigger deal outside the company than inside the company. We say all the time inside the company that we're working on many of our next biggest failures, and we're hopeful that many of the things and most of the things that we're building aren't going to be failures, but you have to be willing to accept that you may fail some things if you're going to really invent brand new customer experiences. And if I look at the phone as an example, the way we measure our builders is not by the outputs. So what I mean by outputs are, the ultimate output is your stock price or revenue or profitability or other examples of outputs. And those matter, and when we certainly, you can have great inputs, and if it doesn't lead to good outputs, it doesn't really matter in the end. But you can't, when you're building something new, you can't predict whether people are going to respond to your product, especially if it's something new. And so we don't measure just the outputs. We will often measure the inputs as well. So did the team have a good idea? Did they actually execute well on that idea? Did they innovate around that idea? Did it operate well? And so when we look at a lot of the initiatives that we've pursued that haven't led to big successes, we really evaluate the teams on how they did on the inputs. And if the inputs are good, then even if the output isn't good, we wish the output was good, but we accept that. And those people end up landing in other really good opportunities inside the company, because if they didn't, no one would want to work on the big, risky new adventure. And we take a lot of the learning, a lot of the technology we built, and a lot of the learning in new products and experiments that didn't work out, and we apply them to a lot of our other businesses, which we've done in every single example where things didn't work out on the output side. So I think if you add all those things up, the hiring a lot of builders, organizing teams so that the builders control their own destiny, giving them the AWS building blocks so they can innovate really quickly and freely, having a leadership structure where we're trying to say yes to new ideas and we're not afraid of failures. it means that not only do you get great ideas from senior people in the company, but the companies that use the cloud, and we see this inside of Amazon, find that people at every level of the organization will spend their free time thinking about new ideas because they know they have a chance to try them, and they know they can see whether or not they'll succeed, and they know if they don't succeed, they'll go to work on the next one. And so I think those are some of the reasons why Amazon is able to invent and innovate as quickly as we do.
Yeah, a couple of very interesting thoughts that you left us with, connected to innovation. One, finding a way to say yes. Second, embracing failure. Those very, very, very interesting thoughts. Andy, let's stay with the subject of culture for a second. And what do you think are the unique things about Amazon Web Services companies should be aware of when they're thinking about partnering with us?
I think that it's a good question, Miguel, and I think actually this is something that companies should really consider when they're choosing an infrastructure provider. As I was mentioning earlier, I think that you have the ability to change your infrastructure provider if you want, but most people aren't going to want to do it if they don't have to, because it's not value-added activity, it's opportunity cost. And so when you're choosing an infrastructure provider to partner with, you're going to really want to make sure that you pick somebody who has a fit with your own culture and your own values. And I think that the technology companies today are all really different. And I've been at Amazon for 20 years at this point, so I have obviously drank the Kool-Aid. But I think there's three things in our culture that are really unique. I think the first is that we are unusually customer-oriented. I think that a lot of companies talk about being customer-focused, but very few walk that walk. Everything we do at Amazon starts with the customer moves backwards. And I think that, most big technology companies today are competitor-focused. They look at what competitors are doing, and then they try to kind of one-up those competitors. And I think there are some that are product-focused, where they say, it's great that you, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, have an opinion about the product, but you should leave that to the experts. We'll take care of that. And those can be successful strategies. They're just not ours. We tend to be very customer-focused. 90% of what we build is informed by what customers tell us matters to them, and the other about 10% is driven by listening to what customers say matters, and even if they can't articulate what that feature is, trying to invent on their behalf. So the first thing is we're really customer-focused. I think the second thing is that we are pioneers, and we like to invent. And again, I think if you look at most big technology companies, they have either lost their will or their DNA to invent. And most will acquire their invention at this point, or many will fast follow. Again, can be very successful strategies. They just aren't our strategy. And I think that if you look at a space that's moving as fast as the cloud is, there's a real advantage to partner with the company that has the most functionality, that's innovating the fastest, that has the most customers and the largest ecosystem and the most maturity. It's, and the company that had the vision for how these things fit together from the start, as opposed to trying to patch them together. And so the second thing is that, we like to invent, we like to pioneer, and we've had a vision over a long period of time for where we think things are headed that we've been executing on for 11 years. Then the third thing is that we're unusually long-term oriented. So you won't ever see us show up at your doorstep the last day before a quarter or a year end, harassing you to do a deal with us, not to be seen again for a few years. And that has really been the kind of MO of a lot of large technology companies over the last number of years. How do I extract the most amount of money in the shortest amount of time to make a quarter or a year? And that's just not our approach. We are trying to build a business and trying to build relationships that outlast all of us in this room. And I think something that kind of pulls those cultural elements together is we have this capability in our support function called Trusted Advisor. And it's a way that we have dozens of programmatic checks in how our customers are using the platform. And if we see something we think you might want to be doing differently, we'll reach out to you. And one of the things we do is we look at all of your unused or low utilization resources and say, hey, you sure you want to pay for these anymore? And over the last couple years, we've sent out a few million of these notices that have led to annualized actual savings for customers of $350 million a year. So I ask you, how many of your technology partners write you and say, hey, I think you should stop spending as much money with us? Not too many. And when we first started doing it, people thought it was some kind of gimmick. But if you understand the unique parts of our culture that I was just talking about, it makes perfect sense. We're so customer focused. We don't want to make money from our customers if they're not getting equal value out of it. We are trying to reinvent an experience that existed over the last couple decades that has not been something that customers have loved. And then we're trying to build a business and relationships that outlast all of us. And the best way to do that is really to do right by your customers over a long period of time. So I think those are the unique characteristics of our company and our business. I think trying to find a partner that you partner with on the infrastructure side who has a culture that you admire or that fits with yours, I think is really important as you think about it in a long-term way.
Thank you, Andy. We got to the end of the session. Unfortunately, I had many more questions
Sure
for
you
you.
did.
So thank you very much. Thanks for spending time with us. Thanks very much for sharing your perspective, your thoughts. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Thank you very much, Andy. Je vous souhaite
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
excellente continuation. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.